Hey guys. Thanks for taking the time to attend the talk. I know there's loads of other things going on, so you have options. I hope this will be interesting. I want to talk about a proposition that we should treat our delivery pipelines like a product, and basically like any other product or service that we deliver. And I think it's quite interesting, the talk Andreas just gave, and a lot of other talks earlier today, introduced a lot of tools and things you can do and best practices. And for me, the question then sometimes is like, okay, so out of all these things that we could do, what is the right thing to do, and what is the right thing at this point in time to do? And I think this is where some of that comes in. And I'll explain that a little bit in more detail as we go. So my name is Marcel. I'm a product manager, so I'm not DevOps at all. I'm not technical. And the reason why I talk about DevOps is that most of my teams, when we come in, we're being tasked to deliver an application or a service or a new product or something like that. But then what we do need in order to be successful with that, we need a mechanism to get ideas through the hands of designers, engineers, into the hands of users, right? And quite frequently what we find is that that mechanism doesn't exist, or the mechanism is just really badly implemented. So quite frequently the projects I work on turn into some kind of DevOpsy project where either on its own or as part of the project proper, there is some work to be done on DevOps tooling, or what I want to call pipeline. I use that word quite liberally. I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that. But basically, quite frequently, we then find that we're working on the mechanism to deliver product, right? So hence my interest in this. Very selfishly, because I want to get ideas into the hands of users, create value for the business, and that is the mechanism for it. I've worked with agencies, clients directly, public sector, private sector, more recently in the crypto space. Right now I'm doing some stuff with EdTech. So this is across all organizations, small or large, startups or blue chips, where I'm seeing the same kind of need to bring a bit of product thinking into this. So the way I look at pipelines is that they're a set of people, tools, practices, technologies that all play together. And ultimately, it starts for me at the business problem where someone has an idea, then goes through some phases of analysis, design, maybe some very early hypothesis testing, ultimately turns into a product in the hands of users where we can then operate the product, learn from it, and kind of go around that circle. Now, if that's a little bit weird for you and you're like, what the fuck, that's not a delivery pipeline. A pipeline is more that thing in the middle where you go from maybe design, even that might be a bit too early, but you started coding where someone, you know, with 10 fast fingers hacks something into a keyboard, that then gets committed, built, deployed, automation testing, etc. In that process, ultimately goes into a live environment, into the hands of users, and then round and round we go. If you think as your pipeline as the middle thing, that's totally cool. What I'll say today will just apply the same. I hope that at the end of the talk you see why I'm making the much bigger picture here and why I think it's valuable to think a little bit broader than that. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. So you can think of this middle bit if you want. Right, so what I want to talk about is why we should treat pipelines as a product, what I mean by product mindset or product thinking, and how that looks in practice, so what you guys can do. So why should you treat a delivery pipeline as a product? So when I meet clients, I sometimes say to them, look, your pipeline isn't what you think it is. It's not a purely technical thing. It's not something that DevOps engineers or software engineers somewhere in a basement built for you, and that you as management or as product people or as business people don't have to worry about. You should actually have an interest in this. Your pipeline matters, and it matters for 3 reasons. So one is that at the bare minimum, it's an enabler. As I said, it's this mechanism that allows you to get ideas through product development into the hands of users. You can then gain feedback and kind of, iterate around this. So if you have the mechanism not in place, and with too many organizations, what I see is that their pipelines are broken. They're not necessarily as slick or seamless as they should be. They satisfy the wrong requirements, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. And they don't do this efficiently. And what this means is that you get less features into the hands of users at lower pace, you have less opportunity to learn, and it's fucking painful for the teams to kind of, get things out. So even if you don't want to worry more about this, you should really see this as a key enabler and see that there is a reason why this is important for an organization. More importantly, though, I think is one size does not fit all. We've already seen today that there's loads of different things you can do, loads of different tools. Think of a bank, financial organization who have different environments, either on-prem or in the cloud, and between these different environments are these handover processes where you need to go through stage gates, certification processes, etc., to be allowed to deploy from one to the next, to the next, to the next. That's one way how a pipeline could look like. I've worked with a commercial services provider who had this idea that because of EU regulations, they had to ensure business continuity. And the way they interpreted this was that they said, well, we need to be cloud agnostic. And we need to be cloud agnostic to the degree where we can switch over from AWS to G-Cloud without downtime, basically now, right? Whether that's the same requirement or not is a different thing, but it again informed their way to look at their pipeline. So another of my clients, a medical services company, had this problem that whenever they would deploy to production live environments, they had to provide release notes to the regulator, and initially they had to take the code base, burn it onto a DVD, put that DVD into an envelope, seal that envelope, hand that envelope to the regulator with release notes, that in case they got sued, they could prove that this is the code base that was live, there was some misdiagnosis happening here, but it wasn't because of the code base. And also they could show that they had mitigated all the risks that were associated with the feature release. So again, very different way of looking at a pipeline and what the pipeline needed to do for them. And then finally, a startup I worked recently with, fintech, and they were like, that's all far too crazy. Fuck that. We go from software engineers' machines right into production every single time, heavy automation testing, and we manage feature availability through launch darkly by feature flagging. Again, very, very different to the other approaches. Now, there is no approach that's right or wrong. Some might be a bit more sane than others, but ultimately, it really depends on the context of your organization and what you need. So one size doesn't fit all. And then finally, if you think, okay, it's an enabler, and one size doesn't fit all, there is something in there that, depending on where your organization is and what you want to achieve as the overarching goals, where you may have an advantage over your competitors. So that medical services company I mentioned, who could only deploy every 3 months, and needed roughly 20 man days to create those release notes, and go through all the regulatory approval processes. By bringing that down, that process, which we helped them to do, to literally a couple of days, they were able to roll out much, much faster at much higher levels of reliability, giving them an edge over some of their competitors. With the fintech startup, it should be obvious that by deploying on demand multiple times a day, you could again be much faster than maybe one of the incumbent big banks that are not following these processes. So, because they matter, and because one size doesn't fit all, you really want to add product thinking or a product mindset to this. Now, what is a product mindset? Well, ultimately, it's about product market fit. When I say market here, what I mean is it's the people using or being impacted by the tooling. So we look at one hand about what do these users need? And I want to say here already that I'm thinking very broad here in terms of users. It's not just your engineers, it's not just your DevOps folk, it's not just your QA guys. It is also your product owners, it's possibly business people, compliance and risk. Everyone who has an interest in anything to do with that pipeline, either because it spits a report out or they need to provide some information. I'll make an example in a second to make that more clear. Then there is the business side of this. As I said, businesses may have certain objectives of how secure their code base needs to be, how reliable the applications that run on the infrastructure need to be, whether they want to be more efficient. Those things play a massive role and need to be actively managed and understood. And then finally, of course, there is the feasibility of what technologies do you use within your team. Is the technology you're picking the right one? Do you have the capabilities to run certain technologies or work at a certain level of scale? Example here with the medical services company, we used Bash as the scripting language, and we found out that no one in the organization had ever done Bash. And we could have just used Python just the same, and that would have been so much easier for the client. So big mistake to just go for Bash because the DevOps lead we were working with kind of had used it before, right? So you need to be very contextual in how you approach your decision making. And product thinking allows you to understand all these different concerns and then balance them quite nicely. So, product thinking, product mindset, product management, all the same thing. It means delivering value, so value to a user or the organization or someone who is impacted by the delivery pipeline in context. And when I say sustainability in mind, what I mean by that is that you make the right decisions now, that stuff that delivers value now without closing options down the line. But you're not optimizing too prematurely, because that would also be wrong. So another example, this service company I mentioned, they wanted us to implement a service mesh right on day one. Whereas actually what we found was that they couldn't even properly deploy into production in a seamless fashion. And we said, why do you want us to work on the service mesh on day one? And they're like, yeah, well, we'll have all these hundreds of microservices soon. When we met them, they had 3. So the question is, do I really need to build a service mesh on day one, or should I not maybe optimize other things in my pipeline and do that later? So that's what I mean by doing things in a sustainable way, that you look at what's needed now rather than what's kind of maybe needed later or maybe never. And then, of course, while you learn, as with any other product, you want to evolve and keep on doing the right thing. So how do you product manage a delivery pipeline? Well, you just add product. I mean, think about this. If you're a software engineering team, and I say to you, just build me a payment gateway, or build me an e-commerce website, or something on the blockchain, I wouldn't just do that. I would give you product support, either product manager or business people that you can speak to, and who will articulate what it is that should be achieved, the reasons for it, and maybe some of the details around that. So why would you not do this for your infrastructure tooling as well? Especially considering that one size doesn't fit all and there's loads of different users to consider. So technically, it's just adding product. It's not a new process. It's nothing in addition. It's what we normally would do with any other application. So word for the worried. This is not about boiling the ocean, right? This is adding a little bit help here and there to make the life of engineers and DevOps engineers easier. It's not about putting people on a leash. It's not about control, and it's not a new methodology. It's just doing what we do for any other product development in addition, and not just keep DevOps teams kind of, in the dark. And I've seen this happen where we say to DevOps teams, just build us a pipeline, build us the most amazing thing, and then they go off and do whatever they think is right, but sometimes without understanding actually what's really important. And that's fine, that's not their fault. So, some illustrations. What I would do is I would always start with goals and maybe opportunities and understanding constraints. So understanding the context. So what is your pipeline supposed to achieve? So with this medical services company, we looked at the pipeline, and they said initially we just want you to containerize apps and spin up pipelines that we can kind of get off on-prem hosted stuff and get into the cloud. And then we realized that while that was very useful, there was this big bottleneck around the creation of these release nodes and getting the certification for an actual production release. And we said, look, we can do all the other stuff for you, but this is a bottleneck that you would really want to address, because it allows you to deploy every other day rather than every 3 months, right? So you need to understand where the organization is, what's important for them, and then hang everything off that. The second thing, I think, is to understand your users. So as I said, the user base for a pipeline is possibly much larger than we normally like to think. You can use one of those models or any other way to articulate your users or your stakeholders. But if you look at this, you have on the left-hand side, you have people who use the product, they have a little bit of an interest in your pipeline and your infrastructure and your setup, because they want this thing to be secure, they want it to be stable, and they want features to be released regularly, right? Then you have the engineering team and your product management team, and then of course also what we found here, we said, okay, so there is someone, the product owner, who is responsible to create those release notes, but they need to work together with the medical regulator, and then suddenly you have compliance come in, you have risk come in, and OPSEC, and all these people are suddenly interested in at least a part of this pipeline, and we need to recognize them. And what we can do, we can use a normal value proposition canvas where we basically outline for, in this case, compliance experts, what are the jobs in yellow they need to do. So they need to generate reports so they can get the certification. And what are their problems in red? Well, providing all documentation for regulators, that's bloody pain, because it takes forever, it's manual, and it's just, writing Word docs isn't a good idea for this kind of thing. And what would be really valuable for them is also having confidence in the quality, and the documentation they provide, because the manual written documents, when we interviewed them, they were never really sure they were anything really valuable, and it wasn't a problem, or it wouldn't have been a problem until the point maybe when they get sued, when suddenly they find that the documentation isn't as good as it should have been. What you can also do is you can model your experience out, and this is just a part. Again, a standard model, experience map, but you could use service blueprints, where you model your pipeline out with the various jobs and tasks. I've looked here at definition, and what we found was that while the product owners went through the process of having an idea, specifying a story, refining that story with the team, and then at some point having to write these release notes when the story would go into, move through the various environments, we found that, as you can see from the orange line there, that initially their stress levels were quite high, because they're like, damn, here is another feature, we don't know how risky that could be. Then they went into the detailed analysis, and that was all fine. But then right before release and during quality assurance, again, they got really anxious, because they needed to make sure that everything, the documentation was A, painful to do, and B, was correct. So by looking at this, you can identify pain points, and then of course at the final part in the pipeline, again, when you deploy, then there is again kind of this area where the compliance people come in, may kind of put a blocker on everything. So again, high levels of stress here. So by modeling something like this out, you can identify where are the points that I should really kind of maybe improve features and implement something. And by understanding the needs and gains and pains, you can then also understand what is the right technology. Is this something that we should automate more maybe, or automate less, or are we using Bash, or are we using maybe Python or some other set of tools? What's the right thing for the users we really want to address? If you want to go a bit more strategic, what I really like is what's called a Wardley map, initially created by Simon Wardley, where you basically model your value chain or your chain of capabilities vertically. How you do this is not that important. It's a tool. This is a tool to kind of really help you brainstorm the different capabilities you need. So you have, there is some design and some coding happening. There is a repo where you put your specifications, your story. So think of it like your Jira. There is some build, there is some deployment, there is some testing, etc. And then what you do, and this is where the magic comes in, you move the thing left and right, dependent on where the stuff sits in the industry maturity. So everything on the left is basically stuff that either hasn't been invented yet or is kind of in the early stages of innovation. And everything on the right are things that you can buy as a commodity. So what you'll find with this, coming back to this medical example, is that cloud hosting is something that's a solved problem, right? You buy as cheap as possible. You would not, at least not in their case, build your own cloud. That does not make sense, right? Dependency management, same things. Container registry, you would not build your own. They have no need. Their requirements are too generic to justify building that. However, on the left-hand side, what we found was that where it comes to risk management, creating release notes, approving releases, all those kind of things, there was a very specific requirement that in that industry, no one had cracked. So we were saying to them, look, this is where you can innovate, where you can maybe work with other suppliers, where you can work with the regulators to build tools or formulate processes in that area. And then, of course, what you can overlay is how important these various things are for the business. And what you can then do is you can decide strategically, do you want to invest in certain areas, or do you want to maybe hand this over to some other supplier, or do you want to put intellectual property protection around some of those things to keep them as a corporate asset. So it's kind of a strategic tool to allow you to make decisions of how you source capabilities, whether you buy or build, and how much effort you put into those. So quite valuable, strong model if you like that kind of thing. Finally, as a final model I want to kind of throw at you, prioritization, right? So you need to understand, out of all the things that you identified as valuable, what do you do first? And the way we do this in product management is we have a feature map or a story map where, again, we have a process at the top, and then these yellow tickets are the various features or stories that you can work on, and they're prioritized top to bottom. And what I've done here with the team is we've said we identified 4 releases. So one release would be just to get the end-to-end deployment, kind of streamlined a little bit. We then work towards certifying a production environment. Then we look at automating compliance, the stuff I've talked about. And then finally, you might want to kind of optimize some of the self-serve infrastructure provisioning. By giving this to a team, the team now has very clear guidance of what should I do first, what should I do next, and also why is it actually valuable, and how does it create value to the business. And of course, these things need to be monitored, and over time they will change, and priorities will shift, and new things will come into this, and so it's a living artifact, a living document. So what does good look like? Well, good looks like, as for any other product, being user-centric, so understanding the people that have an interest in this tooling, branch out a little bit wider, so it's not just your engineers. I think it's a little bit more. It's, as I said, your compliance people and your business people too. There could even be marketing and sales in this if they get certain metrics from the system. And then work iteratively, incrementally, lean, build the right thing at this point in time, learn, see how it's working, and then kind of go round in a circle. So it's about lean evolution. Again, like we would do for most other products. So where does that leave you guys? So I think adding product makes a big difference. My experience working with DevOps teams is that once you give them the guidance and give them the why, they make much better choices. It's also much easier because they know that what they're building is actually the right thing, which I think motivation-wise is just much nicer. The good thing is, the good news is that you don't have to worry too much about it because you will have product people in your teams already. So you can either just grab one and say, look, can you be the product manager or help us or provide us with product management skills for this DevOps pipeline? And if that person is a subject matter expert as well, I mean, that's fantastic. But I think just adding that kind of different way of thinking and asking stupid questions, that can also be really useful. So you can also grab someone who is, like me, not that technical. And over time, they'll learn anyway. And you can do this 2 ways, right? You can go heavyweight in. You can add full level of product management on top, as you would do with another product. Or you can actually say, well, it's not that important. We roughly know what we're doing, but it would be good to sense check this. In which case, you just get someone in from time to time, or anyone here in the room can adopt these principles and just be the de facto product person and just ask, who are the users? Why are we doing this? Is this the right priority? And that might be sufficient. I've done this with very big DevOps teams where you had 1 or 2 product people dedicated to the teams. But I've also done this with startups where it's literally a 1-hour discussion where you're like, okay, so how do we want to deploy? Well, we want to go to production directly. We want to have high levels of automation testing. And security-wise, yes, this is super important because it needs to be compliant with financial regulations, or maybe you find that you're not holding any data, therefore compliance isn't and security isn't such a big thing. And that might be all the discussion you need, right? It very much depends on, again, the context. So this was quite fast, but I hope it was interesting. If you want to know more, there is a website behind this with that presentation and some follow-on information. I'm also around if you want to chat afterwards. Yeah. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you so much.